So good afternoon. This press conference is being convened in order to permit Brad Blair and his spouse, Danielle Blair, to address the public, answer your questions, and give you information on next steps in terms of their journey in their search for accountability with the Government of Ontario. A number of different materials have been provided to you just to give you some guidance. First of all, you've been provided a copy of Mr. Blair's statement that he will be reading from shortly. Secondly, you've been provided a list of what we call suspect appointments plus other appointments that tell a very sad story about the very questionable appointments that have literally plagued this government. You've also been provided a copy of a summary of the statement of claim that represents the commencement of a lawsuit today, a $15 million lawsuit on behalf of the Blair family to seek accountability from the Government of Ontario for their treatment. You've also been provided, in addition to those things, a press release calling for a commission of inquiry. So with that, I'll commence the formal portion of this press conference. We're asking that the format of this be specifically, I'll provide some brief opening comments. I know you want to hear, of course, from former Deputy Commissioner Blair, and that's what's going to happen. And then you will also have an opportunity to ask questions of Mr. Blair, of Danielle, and of me as his legal counsel. Today, September 13th, 2019, a $15 million lawsuit was commenced. Wrongful termination, abuse of public office, breaches of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And in this over 50-page statement of claim, a very sad story is told about how the firing of Brad Blair simply represents the tip of the iceberg in terms of constant and repeated examples of utter contempt for protocol, for conflicts of interest, and for acting in the public interest by Premier Ford, his Chief of Staff, and other bureaucrats. The statement of claim that was filed today is the only way Brad Blair can push for accountability. What is exceedingly clear, given the utter failures of our legislative watchdogs, is that nothing short of a commission of inquiry convened under the Public Inquiries Act will actually give a full airing to the issues. Of course, we're all inquiry tired. The calling of an inquiry is a refrain that becomes at times boring. But if ever there was a case for one, it is now. You are faced with a premier who is implicated in umpteen numbers of tainted appointments, who is telling the people of Ontario that he's conducting a review to figure out if he did bad things. It is insulting to the intelligence of the people of Ontario that Premier Ford believes he can be trusted to do this work. So we are calling for a commission of inquiry with very little confidence that this government will do the right thing. The only way Brad Blair can continue a path insisting on accountability is a lawsuit and to pursue the matter before the Divisional Court. All of those I'm instructed to pursue aggressively and actively. Thank you. Mr. Blair?
Well, thank you, Julian, and thank you, everyone, for attending today. And thank you to my wife for being here to support me. On March 4th, 2019, Deputy Minister Di Tommaso abruptly, and in my opinion, unlawfully, ended my 33-year career with the Ontario Provincial Police. I have served the OPP faithfully and honorably since 1986, and due to my efforts in safeguarding the independence and credibility of the province's largest service from improper political interference, I was fired. My OPP career began on March 24th, 1986, with a posting to Red Lake. It was my dream to become an OPP officer. and I felt a debt of gratitude to the OPP and to the people of the province of Ontario for the opportunity to serve them. During my time in Red Lake, I was fortunate to work with some of the most dedicated officers I would interact with in my career. My coach officer was from Red Lake, and he taught me about the importance of public trust and how hard it is to earn and how easy it is to lose. He also taught me about the responsibility and the role that police officers play in their communities other than being law enforcers. Those are lessons that I carried with me throughout my career. It has always been important to me that the OPP be an institution that the people of Ontario trust to carry out its duties in a fair and impartial manner. On November 5th, 2018, I assumed command of the Ontario Provincial Police as the interim commissioner. I assumed command of the OPP as a result of an order in council proposed by the Premier of Ontario and supported by Cabinet. On that same day, I submitted my resume, indicating my intention to compete for the commissioner position on a full-time basis. As a result of having nearly 33 years of service with the OPP at that time, the last 5 years as the deputy commissioner, all I expected was to be given consideration to compete in a fair and transparent selection process. In assuming responsibility for Canada's second largest police service, even on an interim basis, I understood and accepted that I was solely responsible for maintaining the OPP's operational integrity, maintaining the public's trust, and ensuring the mistakes of the past were not repeated. I believed that I was duty-bound as commissioner to come forward. I believed at the time of coming forward that the OPP commissioner's process was the entire iceberg in terms of cronyism. But as the months passed and the numerous examples of further cronyism were identified, it became evident that the commissioner's process was the tip of the iceberg. I was fired on March 4th, 20 days shy of 33 years of service, for reasons that are still not clear to me. A firing that was unlawful and done without any due process. A firing that, if left unchallenged, puts every OPP officer at the risk of suffering the same fate. A firing that was done to silence me and dissuade me from seeking a response to allegations that I had made. Allegations that were made to the Ombudsman in writing and under oath to the Integrity Commissioner. To date, there are allegations that have yet to be investigated by either the Integrity Commissioner or the Ombudsman. Instead, those two legislative watchdogs have tossed the allegations back and forth, with neither taking responsibility for conducting a full investigation. It is a result of the systemic failure of these institutions to fulfill their mandates that a public inquiry into these matters is the only path forward to adequately address the serious issue of cronyism that hangs over this government and to restore the public's trust. The Integrity Commissioner's report on the Commissioner selection process in March specifically identified the involvement of the Premier's office. In particular, it identified the actions of the Chief of Staff, Dean French, and the complicit actions of public servants. Yet nothing happened, and the cronyism continued. Eventually, numerous examples of cronyism led to the resignation of the Chief of Staff, and the only response has been that the Premier's office will conduct a review. An entity accused of wrongdoing itself and investigating itself is not a hallmark of accountability or transparency, and it erodes public trust. I competed for the position of Commissioner of the OPP as a result of my sincere desire to continue to contribute to the safety of the people of Ontario and to continue to remain part of an organization that I love. The spouses and partners and families of emergency service personnel are special people who pay a significant price in supporting their loved ones. My firing without any due process or opportunity to defend myself came as a shock to us. The impact of the firing has quite frankly traumatized me, my wife, and my family. We have been cut off from our OPP family and isolated from the organization we were dedicated to. We have suffered from social anxiety and have lost trust in the very institutions we have always respected. I do not expect that Premier Ford will do the right thing and hold a public inquiry into these matters. And that is why I call on the good people of the good people of the province to join me in demanding an inquiry be held. That the people of Ontario let their elected representatives know that this is not the way we expect our government to be run, using the government as a vehicle to appoint friends to positions of power and great financial gain.
Thank you, Brad. I have some comments to make about the legal proceedings that have been commenced, and then we'll open the floor for questions. Firstly, in terms of the documents you've been provided, there's a screen to my left that is scrolling. There is a document called Appointments and Issue among the 6 documents you've provided. If you flip to it for a moment, please. It's called Appointments and Issue. You will see that first there is a section called Suspect Appointments. All egregious cases that are simply embarrassing by virtue of appointments of family members, close friends, abandonment of process by the Government of Ontario. These people have either been fired, have resigned, or stay in power, continuing to purport to exercise public powers while serious issues exist regarding public trust. The second category, and please note that among these 8 is the current Deputy Minister, number 8, page 3. The circumstances surrounding his appointment, the ushering out of the former Deputy Minister, the clearing of the way for Ron Taverner. Within 2 days of DiTomaso's appointment, magically the qualifications for the Commissioner of the OPP are watered down so that magically Mr. Taverner qualifies. All of that is a matter of record. The exceptional elevation of an individual who never rose above the rank of staff superintendent to the top bureaucrat of policing stands as brand new. At page 4 of that same document, 3 suspect departures, terminations of high-ranking public officials, all stand as question marks. Matthew Turigian, in the Integrity Commissioner's report, he quotes Orsini as feeling pressured to make one of the Ford family friends the head of the OPP. The same Orsini who utterly disavows any claims that this was an independent process. You know, the claims by the Premier, by Minister Jones, in the House, to the people of Ontario, that this was an independent process. What little regard these public officials must have for our intelligence. Matthew Turigian, Steve Orsini, Brad Blair. Strange departures and terminations, all begging more questions than they answer. Page 6. The title is Other Notable Ford Ties. These appointments all beg more questions than answers. Who do we rely upon to restore trust? How many other appointments are currently exercising public powers or important powers as a result of problematic relationships, personally or otherwise, with the Fords. The scrolling list is the iceberg. We just don't know how deep it runs. But the assurances you have been given is not to worry. You may take comfort. Premier Ford is on the case. He is going to faithfully investigate Premier Ford. How little regard must they have for our intelligence? At what stage does this exercise simply become a mockery? There is no way of telling how deep this runs without an effective mechanism for accountability. It is true that Justice Wake's report, the Integrity Commissioner's report, makes important findings with absolutely no consequences for the public officials involved. That is, not one public official, other than being named in the report, has suffered any consequences as a result of the damning observations in the report, prompting our Premier to do a victory lap with the issuance of Justice Wake's report. He's been cleared, claimed Ford. And how could you blame him? Not a single consequence for a single public official flowing from the Integrity Commissioner's report. But Keystone Cop number 1 isn't the end of it. Keystone Cop number 2 is our ombudsman. With literal blinders in front of his eyes, he fails to investigate any actions of any bureaucrat, pointing to the fact that this is all about the actions of politicians. Need I remind you who Mr. Orsini is, who Mr. French is? These are not politicians. These are powerful political figures who exercise powers entrusted to them by the people of Ontario that the Ombudsman is obligated to investigate but has failed to do so. Our legislative watchdogs have turned into toothless accountability mechanisms, and it lies to a commission of inquiry to fix this. The hiring of a police service by appointing a friend, including reducing the qualifications so the friend qualified, all with the objective of the Premier having at his disposal the Ontario Provincial Police. The ramifications for us as a democracy are profound. And for the Integrity Commissioner to take no steps in consequence of these findings, for the Ombudsman to refuse to investigate, makes their roles as legislative watchdogs shams. That is why we call for a commission of inquiry. That is why this lawsuit is as broad as it is. It's not simply a wrongful termination. It's about abuse of power.
Can you tell us about the day you were told, sir?
Sure. March 4th. This past March 4th, 2019, at GHQ headquarters in Aurelia, Deputy Minister D. Tomaso was waiting in Interim Commissioner Gary Couture's office for me to arrive. And I was summoned to the office and brought in and sat down, and I was subsequently terminated.
And I want to be clear, this is the same D. Tomaso who was the subject of the complaint by Blair. He personally oversaw the firing. This government has no concept of conflict of interest. High school students could have figured out he should have been distant from this process. Public allegations of breaches of the act against a police officer by a public official that were not accompanied by any investigation whatsoever. That is not a single police officer in professional standards departments across this province would pick up the torch that the Premier was obviously trying to hand to someone to get them to prosecute Mr. Blair. Not a single professional standards officer agreed with the Premier. What happened? The Premier and his bureaucrats, who are sworn to be loyal to him, bypassed the Police Services Act and engaged in this bizarre summary process. This is what should interest everybody. They claimed to us, and it's not because he was deputy commissioner. It's not because there was an order in council. They claimed to us that every member of the OPP is a public servant under the Public Service Act, and therefore they can terminate pursuant to this bizarre Public Service Commission that is laughable in terms of its conflict of interest rules. Example, Deputy Minister Boniferro, the Deputy Attorney General, who sat on the hiring panel of Taverner, sits on the Services Commission. De Tomaso, clearly implicated in these complaints, has a private meeting with them, and then they fire him. If they're right that every OPP officer who is a public servant under this act can be fired this way, then I just need everybody to know that that's 5,000 to 7,000 police officers who should now wonder about stepping out of line with this Premier and these bureaucrats.
I was the commissioner of the OPP, so let's make that clear. I was responsible for the organization. The commissioner of the OPP is an independent entity from government. And the commissioner of the OPP, in circumstances like that, has no police services board. And by the way, I think the Ontario Provincial Police may now be the only police service in Canada that doesn't have a police services board. And so I had no one to go to as the deputy minister, who I would normally report to administratively, was involved in the process. My other option would have been the deputy minister of the Attorney General. He too was involved in the process. I was stuck on an island by myself as the commissioner of the OPP with my conscience, and to do the right thing.
Orsini writes that this was anything but independent. He wrote that. So the Premier and the Minister lied to the people of Ontario. This was not independent.
How did you arrive at the $15 million number? And is each person named in the lawsuit being sued individually for that number, sir?
Negative. So the $15 million reflects the assessment by our office of the extent of the damages, both in the form of damages due and owing for what the legal system calls professional capital punishment, because that's what this is, right? You take a 32-year career and you flush it down in the toilet. Instead of being recognized for his service, it's flushed down the toilet. The Ontario Court of Appeal, in a libel case formerly involving former Justice Casey Hill, as a Crown attorney, awarded $10 million in terms of how he was libeled. It's very difficult to put a final number on it. What I can tell you is the punitive damages are substantial. That is the claim for punitives. Punitives are all about expressing society's condemnation for the actions of the defendants. That, combined with the wrongful termination and the abuse of power and the Family Law Act claims you've heard from Danielle today. You've heard how it affects his family. All of that leads to the $15 million figure. The right rules, had they been followed, and had it been fairly done, Ron Taverner would have not been qualified to fill the position. Why? Because staff superintendents don't generally take over as commissioners of the country's second largest police service. It's unprecedented. So the short answer to your question is the lawyer is explaining why the term unqualified is there. Because if the rules had been followed and if it had not been rigged, he wouldn't have qualified. He qualified because De Tomaso watered it down. And he watered it down to get Taverner in. That's what we say legally, and that's what we stand by.
I lost my father at the age of 21 to cancer. And if you've ever lost a parent, you'll know the incredible amount of sadness and loss that you feel. That's how I would compare it. That's what it feels like to me. The OPP was my family. I have worked from Windsor to Ottawa, from Fort Erie to Fort Severn, and every place in between. I gave my life. I sacrificed time from my family and from my children to do my job. And even when I was home, I wasn't always present because I was available 24/7 to support the organization and what we were trying to do in terms of providing public safety to this province. And that was taken from me.
The difference between lies and truth, all right? The difference between opaque and transparent. So they lied about trying to get their buddy in. They told the truth about putting Karik in. That's the difference between a utter public loss of confidence and public trust. It's the difference between lies and truth. So if the Premier lies to the people of Ontario about a process, and his chief of staff, who sits shoulder to shoulder late at night in the office, takes personal instruction from him, lies about the process, please don't tell me later it made no difference. How can you lie about creating the leader of the second largest police service in the country, a person, that is Taverner, who just happens to be your loyal, longtime friend, and someone tell me no harm, no foul? I utterly can't accept that that's how we run a democracy. And in fact, so we're clear, if that's how we run a democracy, it won't be a democracy for very long. So that's the difference. The difference is there was an effort to pull the wool over the eyes of the people of Ontario. Look at the scrolling list. Taverner is a tip of the iceberg. Now look at the list. You know, why don't you say that for every single person on this list? We created to you suspect appointments list. Why don't you say that for every one of them? Why don't you say it about Ms. Powell, French's niece? Why don't you say it about the way this government has chosen to use the Public Accountants Council to make appointments? What this is about is not whether somebody is qualified, not qualified, a good person. It's whether you lie. It's whether you're furtive. It's whether you have a complete, utter, reckless disregard for process. These are top officials entrusted with huge resources. If they are lying and cheating, the consequences are interminable. And we don't know how deep it runs. We still don't. And everyone can take comfort. Everyone can take comfort because Doug Ford's on it. He'll report back to us about how much Doug Ford lied and cheated. It's ridiculous.
Mr. Falcon, I do find it, should ask you, like, we've been asking the government for weeks and months about details of this public appointments review process and really don't get any answers back. What do you take from that?
Commission of Inquiry, independence. We don't have legislative watchdogs with the capacity or the will to do their job. The Integrity Commissioner had his chance. He issued an important report. It just has absolutely no consequences. Premier Ford thought it was a win. The Ombudsman, well, he just ducked. So in view of what amounts to, respectfully, Keystone Cops as our legislative watchdogs, a commission of inquiry is the only answer because it is a transparent public process in which, example, Secretary Orsini would be under oath, explaining to us why he resigned the same day, the exact same day that the Premier submitted a letter to the Integrity Commissioner saying, for corroboration on this, please look to Mr. Orsini. Mr. Orsini said, nobody here but us chickens, and literally announced his retirement the same day. This is a mockery. I'm not making this stuff up. You can't. So we don't know how deep it runs. So how do you solve that? How do you address that? Well, you don't turn to the guy in charge who's orchestrating it, the Premier, and ask him to solve it, right?
My question would be, and it would be broader than just the Premier, it would be also to the Cabinet, is how did any of them think that appointing the friend of the Premier to the Commission of the OPP was a good idea? How did not one person, because I'm told in terms of listening to what the Premier had said that it was unanimous. How did not any of them stand up and say, hey, listen, this is not a good idea. This is not a good idea in terms of the public's trust in the operational integrity of the OPP. You know, it could have been Sir Robert Peel, the father of policing, and he can't be the commissioner of the OPP if he's the friend of the premier. It just doesn't work that way. The OPP is an entity that needs to has its operational integrity. The public needs to see that it is separate from the government, that it operates independently from the government. The OPP investigates the government.
Was that a concern that you had personally as well, as the interim commissioner of the OPP, that somebody who has, long-standing links to the Ford family was named as the OPP commissioner? Did you worry about interference, about independence?
Obviously, you'd worry about that. And it's not whether or not the conflict would be real, it's whether or not it's perceived. And the impact to the OPP officers who out there day after day do their job. The OPP already struggles with the stigma that we are an extension of government. I've heard it my entire career. You're just collecting money for the government. I pay your salary, right? That's what the OPP deals with on a daily basis because of our name, the Ontario Provincial Police. We are a separate, independent, operational entity who has to, and from time to time, and you're well aware, we investigate government. And we do it very well. We are independent. We are not servants. We are not agents of the government. And that is the requirement that has to maintain public trust. So what plays out if that does not occur? Public loses its trust in the OPP officers. So an OPP officer stops a car on the side of the road, and the public's now interacting because they don't trust the officer, and they're making comment. So that increases the propensity for complaints against officer. It could increase the amount of physical altercations that could occur, and more importantly, victims of crime may not trust us and may not come forward. And who suffers? We all suffer. Our communities suffer because they don't trust the police. And you can go back in history and the role the police have played, whether it's with the 60 scoop, whether it's with residential school. We have a history, and we are not trusted in certain communities because of the role that we played. And we work very hard on a day-to-day basis to show the people of Ontario that we are independent, and we will do our jobs without government interference.
The documents in issue were filed in February. They were filed in February, of this year, and sat in the court for 10 days. We didn't provide them to the media at all. These documents were filed in court, and they were filed in support of the Ombudsman Divisional Court application. They sat in the court system for 10 days. At the same time they were filed, so day number 1, a copy was provided to the Ministry of the Attorney General, to the Attorney General's office. They took no steps to raise a red flag about what was in the documents. They took no steps to seal up the documents. How little regard for the intelligence of the people of Ontario does this government have?
So I stand by the information that was provided to me by the senior officers within the OPP. I stand by them and what they said. I stand by the documents that I filed with the divisional court, and I was transparent in bringing that information forward.
So that was information you got from senior officers who had conversations
In
with
every case, I did not solicit information. That information came to me in the course of my duty as the Commissioner of the Ontario Provincial Police.
and
It was brought to me by officers with significant concerns.
And the short answer to your question is yes, that's right. The information came to him
not
through
to
senior
you
officers.
directly, but to the senior officers.
That's
and
correct.
then related to you.
Yes.
Mr. Blair, would you like to return to policing in any capacity?
Well, thank you for that question. Yes, I would. I look forward and I wish to return to the OPP and wear my uniform once again, and to go through the process at some point and retire with dignity. Investigations aren't always there to find guilt or blame certain people. It's there to clear the air, to bring out the truth. And to date, no one has agreed to conduct any investigations, and certainly I was not going to be directing an investigation take place. We, the OPP, were going to be witnesses. So that would have been an abuse of authority by me to direct OPP officers to investigate. I went the normal route to find the bodies that were the watchdogs whose mandate it is to investigate these things. That's all I've asked for.
As to the failure of our legislative watchdogs, to the point that you should have no faith in their ability to continue to do this work. And there needs to be a clearing of the air, because we honestly don't know how deep the iceberg goes. Can anybody here give me any assurance that the 8 suspect appointments identified are the only ones that are a problem? Like, how do you know how much deeper it runs? What else did French do? What did Orsini do? We don't have any way of knowing that. And there didn't seem to be an overriding interest in getting past that, getting to that.